Hi, everyone. Rod Berger here. You know, I've been incredibly fortunate over the years to capture the stories of global icons, Hall of Fame athletes, entertainers, NGO leaders, and political figures. I've traveled the world and back again, and you know what? I think it's time to shed light on the scribes of our time, those who have contributed to communities across our planet, securing opportunities for the disenfranchised, denying affronts to democracy, and establishing secure passage through choppy geopolitical seas. It's time to learn about the people behind the pens of policy and the keystrokes of democracy. Join me as we go behind the scenes with government and military leaders, cabinet members, visionaries, and sought-after intelligence officers. Let's go beyond the headlines to discover the bylines of our times. This is the Dr. Rod Berger Show, presented by Fair Observer. Welcome to the Dr. Rod Berger Show, presented by our friends at Fair Observer. Independence, diversity, debate. Understand the world one perspective at a time. Want to thank Fair Observer as we're kicking off our second season of the Dr. Rod Berger Show. And I just felt as if we're living in a time of great tumult where it feels like second by second the world is changing, and the ripple effects are felt far and wide. And so I'm expanding my guest list in ways that are really challenging. It's challenging to me, and I hope it's eye-opening to you. But I want to focus on people who have fantastic legacies and experiences to help us all learn a little bit about how we should be thinking about today, tomorrow, and the near future. We're going to be welcoming in Martin Plaut. He was born in South Africa. Martin is currently Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies and holds the same post with King's College London. He studied at the universities of Cape Town, Witwatersrand, and Warwick before joining the Labour Party as Secretary on Africa and the Middle East in 1984. He joined the BBC, working primarily on Africa. He became Africa editor at World Service News, retiring in 2013. He's advised the British and American governments, as well as the European Parliament, and he has published widely on the Horn of Africa and Southern Africa. You also published something else in 2007, Martin. And I just love that in doing research on you. Let's start there. Let's start with a little bit of levity in that regard, but The Hamster on Hampstead Heath. Tell me about the origins of that book.
Well, I live pretty close to Hampstead Heath. I go and do exercise and walk on it and various things about 3 or 4 times a week. It's shall we say, it's where my soul resides. And of course, why else is it called Hampstead Heath? Because there's a hamster there, of course. I mean, you don't have to look very far.
And my son is named Heath, so I feel like I had to start with that. I was saying to you off air, your background to me is incredibly interesting, and it feels a little bit like, it's not just like one movie. It feels like there are several movies that are a part of the story that is you in your life. Take me back to your father and really being a refugee leaving Nazi Germany. Talk a little bit about the origins of your nuclear family. As we start to understand a little bit how that shaped the person you are today.
It's complicated, but my father was an apprentice as a cabinet maker in Düsseldorf in Germany, and in the 1930s, like many people, he saw what was going on. He knew that people were being arrested, beaten up, and he just thought this is going one way. And he had some relatives in South Africa, in Johannesburg. My great aunt, I think she was, used to sell insurance from the back of an ox wagon cart, and then later sold secondhand clothing. And he went and lived with her, and then went to Cape Town, joined a friend, and began a business. And he became a businessman, designing furniture, selling furniture. And then after the Second World War, came to London, met my mother, who just bizarrely had been born in Cape Town on the way back from India. And then they got married after knowing each other for just 3 occasions, and came back to South Africa and lived there, where they had myself and my brother and sister.
How vivid! Selling insurance, the way you paint that's I just love that imagery. And I know that you worked with your father, right, in his furniture store for about 4 years as a young man. Is that correct?
It is, and I was pretty bad at it. I was not a very good salesman, And he hoped I would be, but I wasn't. I did design the odd piece of furniture, but I was really not good. And I spent most of the time, let me be honest, chatting up girls.
I know that this may be a bit of a stretch in this regard, right? But I shared this. It's in my book. I talk about, but having a father that was a part of or under the reign, sadly, of Nazi Germany and the impacts that can have on families. I've talked with a lot of people about how as a youth, I wanted to know so much about my dad, but it was always such a mystery that I painted. He would give me little nuggets here and there. And then at one point, when I was 9, 10, he basically just shared with me everything that he hadn't shared with anybody else, at least in America. And I'm wondering what it was like for you as a youth. Did you know much about your father's history? Was that something that was discussed, or did you share in some of that generational mystery that I did?
A mixture. I mean, he did talk about it a little bit, but not in any great detail. I think it was very painful for him, as it was for many of that generation. And it was only towards the very end of his life, when I was living in London, he was in South Africa, and I got notification that he was dying of tumor in the brain, and that they would give him hydrocortisone. I could go there, and for about 10 days, he'd be really lucid, and then he'd go downhill at the end. So I went back there, and he had a box of photographs from the period which he'd brought over from Germany from the 1930s, which had the family in great detail, beautiful studio photographs, those old prints that used to be made in a studio. And he then went through one by one my family, and that brought it all to life, which was a marvelous experience. And then he died.
Did it map to what you had thought or what you had envisioned? And the reason I ask is that I was actually for this show, about a year and a half ago, I interviewed a researcher who's basically cobbling together, I think it's over 130 experts and historians on Nazi Germany. And I shared a story with him, and he basically told me, which I really appreciated, but it was formidable for me even at my age, which was that the story that my father had shared, this one instance, that it couldn't have been the way in which it was portrayed. And it left me wondering, was my father trying to paint a picture that had a little bit more romanticism or sort of this heroic arc, right? Even as a boy, that felt better for him to share with his son. And I too had that moment on my father's deathbed, or very close to, where he basically pulled out a map because I was fascinated with where things were in location and how that impacted the timeline, the chronological order of things. When you were sitting there and he's lucid in those moments, did it feel as if you were learning something brand new over time, or had you had a loose blueprint in your mind of what he was sharing?
I mean, I knew something about most of them, but I mean, for example, he gave me a gold watch, which had been given to one of my relatives who had been a rabbi. And he had sent his wife to Palestine, as it then was, under the British mandate, to try and keep them safe. And just before the Second World War, he died, and his wife left her children in Israel, went back to Germany to be with the community. She said, "I can't leave them alone." And of course, she went to the death camps, and that was terribly moving. And I've now handed that watch on to my nephew, and I hope that he will look after it as I did.
What do you think the symbolism? One, I did not. I so appreciate this sort of line of thinking or this path we're going down. But I've always been fascinated with people during wartime, where there's this sense or this relationship to time that I don't think we have currently, or at least the younger generations don't. You might not. It's hard to remember what you had for breakfast yesterday, let alone what day was it when, let's say, Hitler died, or when the Nazis, rolled into Poland, or these sorts of things. And I find that generation, many of them gone, their understanding and relationship to time, as if it's the rope in underwater cave diving, that if you lose that rope, you're gone. You have to stay tethered to that rope. And when you talked about the watch, I remember the same thing. My father and other people I've interviewed from that time frame, a watch feels like it was very symbolic as a gift down, that there's a story as if they're handing it to you. And yet you just shared that watch, and then that you've given it as well. Any thoughts on that and the relationship to time that's different from generation to generation?
Well, I agree with you. Those symbols are really, really important, and they are part of your of your being. They are deep inside you. I mean, I have somebody I know who actually went through a similar experience, but even earlier. I mean, his father was a founding member with Rosa Luxemburg of the German Communist Party. His father, not his grandfather, in 1913. And they were arrested, beaten up, had to flee to Switzerland, then to Paris, then to Marseille. And he got on the boat with Walter Benjamin, whom you may know of. And they were then kicked off. They had to walk over the Pyrenees. Amazing stories. And his father then went on to Mexico and lived, I suppose, with probably Trotsky. He lost touch with his father. And his mother goes back to Berlin and then goes to London. And he grows up in London and becomes a professor at a university here. So, I mean, these are extraordinary stories. You can't replicate that today. I mean, it's just incomparable. And our time is, people say, oh, we're having a difficult time. I don't think we are even having a remotely difficult time compared with what they faced.
Yeah, we don't understand. There's no context. I don't think that it's, and with a news cycle that is this rapid, I don't think I don't think we're equipped to be able to digest, understand, sit with something. I mean, how often do people sit with ideas now, or with no ideas and sort of blank and just sort of allowing the world around them to impact or influence a decision or an idea that they might have? I can't help but think how interesting is. I want to pivot a little bit to your career and the path you took, but to stay with your father and your family. Was there a moment where, as a young person, that you recognized in yourself that you could feel for others, you could feel the stories, even if you didn't know them? Like there was a sense about you that there was a radar that had a level of sensitivity that impacted you, whereby if you look back now, it probably played a role in you either not being a very good furniture salesman or in the pursuits that you ended up reaching for and doing quite well. I'm just curious as to, I feel like you'd have to have a sensibility that is, it's like you can put your ear to the train tracks and know how far away that train is. And that has to have a lasting impact in the way in which you look at the world around you and the way in which you want to chronicle that.
Well, my mother was really my strongest influence in that regard. I mean, she was a member of something in South Africa. Don't forget, this was the 1960s, 1950s, 60s, 70s, the height of apartheid. And she was somebody who joined something called the Black Sash. The Black Sash was a white women's organization, and they went to stand outside of Parliament. No more than 5 of them were allowed to be there at one time, with a black sash across their chests, and they were allowed to hold a placard. And the placard would say usually, this is wrong, or apartheid is wrong, or we do not approve of this bill. You do not speak in our name, that kind of thing. And I think from my mother, I learned the issue of right and wrong. And my mother always told me, for example, never to put down my race classification. Now, sometimes I had to be honest. But even to this day, when people endlessly ask you for your race in forms, I resist it. I say I'm an African, and if they want to know what the color of my skin is, well, they can come and see me.
And so you feel, so it's what's fascinating about that. Of course, I don't know your parents, so I say this with great respect, but it's that, your father was right there, in the heat of oppression and all that sort of, the flame that then grew into an incredibly sad and tragic fire. And your mother is showing you the advocacy side of things, like the standing up, whether that's with voice or with representation. Is that fair? There was a sensibility, almost like what to do with what you're handed. Like your father, his response was he had to get out of there, which I fully understand and appreciate. And she's saying, okay, with that, we can do something.
Absolutely. And I mean, they used to both go and talk and teach at the night schools, which were established for Black people in Cape Town, particularly Africans, to learn literacy. And they used to teach them literacy skills. And they had friends across the color bar, which in South Africa was incredibly rare at that time.
And dangerous, correct?
Not dangerous. No, it
Not
wasn't.
dangerous.
It
Why do
was
we have that perception? Because I think in the U.S. that's the perception. We would think that would have been a dangerous choice on their.
If you'd had sexual relations, it would have been dangerous. But to be friendly was not dangerous. It just didn't happen very much. And I tell you, the very worst thing in my mind about apartheid as a white person was that it felt normal. It felt ordinary. It felt unsurprising when you saw a bus which said whites only on it. That's what happened. If you walked into the post office and it said this entrance is for whites only, black people go around the back, that felt normal. I'll just give you one example. There was a beach that I went to as a child, and this is honestly, it takes some beating. It was a very remote area, small beach, only enough room for a limited number of people. Morning, a flag used to go up, let's say red, I can't remember the color, and then only whites could go. At about 11 o'clock, another flag would go up, and then people of mixed race, or colored people, as we call them in South Africa, could go. And then at lunchtime, there would be a different colored flag, and then Africans or people, black people could go. And then there was a period when there was a different colored flag, a white flag, where nobody could go to let the blackness go out of the out of the beach, and then it was the whites all over again. I mean, you couldn't make it up.
And so I want to, the way in which you put that it was normal. So help those that can't fathom that, because I'm thinking of two things. One, so I love documentaries. I was raised on that by my father. That was one of the gifts he gave me, was to watch 60 Minutes before what happened currently. When I was very young, I learned what the word propaganda meant. He said information was power, so that you can respect all people. And, when I said, well, is that a dangerous choice of your parents to be, teaching and advocating? It immediately made me, when you said no, it was more about if there were sexual relations, because in the U.S., in the South, I mean, we had Emmett Till, he was lynched because he, said hello to a white woman in a store, right? I mean, you couldn't just be friendly in that regard. And so when you say that you walked around knowing, with that sense of this is just normal, this is sort of who we are, how should I understand that? Even at my age, like I hear you say that, and it's like putting a square peg in a round hole, right? Because I don't want to be ignorant and think, well, in essence, I would have recognized the difference. Because when you're in the midst of it, to your point, it is just the way the sun rises and sets in the direction that you see, right? How should I understand that? Or how would you communicate to an American, let's say youth, that's trying to understand what it's like to feel that and know that it's normal in that space, but yet everything in your fibers says it's not?
Of course. And that is the difference between, I think, look, I don't know enough about the American South to be able to comment, but I mean, the difference, I think, was this. Apartheid was a system of laws and regulations. They were very tightly controlled. But when you have a tightly controlled legal system with laws, regulations, what you can and can't do, in a sense, you don't need to have a system where people are beaten up or killed for doing the wrong thing, because everybody knows what they're allowed to do. I mean, let me give you one specific example. If you were a black person, to come into a white designated town, you had to have what was called a pass book. And if you could only be there if, bizarrely, you were a 10(1)B. In other words, section 10(1)B of a particular bit of legislation. You could be there if you had a job to do, or you'd been living there for, I've forgotten, 10, 15, or 20 years. Then you had the right to be in that town. Otherwise, you had no right to be there. As soon as it's a white policeman, and don't forget, most of the policemen were actually not white. They were people of color. If they challenged you, and anybody could challenge you, any of them could challenge you, they could say, "Where's your pass?" And if you couldn't show your pass, you were arrested and you were thrown out of the town, jailed, and all the rest of it. And there is an amazing, amazing play by Ethel Fugard called Sizwe Banzi is Dead. And it is precisely on this issue that somebody finds a pass book that belongs to somebody who has died. And his friend, who is a photographer, said, "Look, become him. Just take this passbook. I will photograph you and put your picture in it." And that's why, you have to die in order to be here. And that was why it was the most shocking. And this was put on during apartheid. I can still remember it in a tiny theater. You literally felt as if the security police would break through the door at any time. They didn't.
What was the air like in that theater? Take me in there, because the fact that was taking place then, I would think that it's almost hard to find enough oxygen for the patrons that were there that evening.
Absolutely. It was like that. And yet it was only 3/4 full. I mean, he was the most remarkable playwright, and he worked with two people, John Carney and, unfortunately, I can't remember the other person's name, both extremely brilliant actors. And he didn't write a play, he would work with them to produce this play. And what it did was that for the first time, you, as a white person, saw what it was to be a black person in your face. It was absolutely happening there.
So two questions on that evening. What was it that helped you basically cross the threshold into that theater, or that front door that night? And how were you changed when you crossed back over it as you walked into the streets from that theater?
Well, look, I liked theater. I always have liked theater. And, it was a small theater. We went to more or less everything they put on. And, when I walked out, I was absolutely shocked. I went across the street and had a few beers. I mean, it was, and of course I couldn't have taken a black person into that bar, because black bars were, of course, segregated. So, that was what was so extraordinary. But as I tell you now, the worst part about it was that it felt normal. I mean, I thought it was bizarre, terrible, and all the rest of it. Who cared what I thought? It still felt normal. You went onto a beach, there were only white people there.
I hope you're enjoying today's interview. If you'd like to learn more about my work or advertise on one of my shows, you can visit me at drrodberger.com, or you can visit me in the lab, as I like to call it, at narrativestack.ai. You can also purchase my book, The Narrative Edge, Authentic Storytelling That Meets the Moment, wherever books are sold. And now, back to the interview. It almost sounds as if you knew that your clothes, as an example, it's like you knew that your shirt didn't fit, but it was the only shirt you could wear. And if that's the case, it feels like you always know it's there, right? Like, is that just something that, one, you acknowledge, you knew that this was what was going on, and your position on it. But how do you shake that so that you can, I mean, everybody wants to feel some level of homeostasis. You want to be, you'd like a resting heart rate where you can live in some level of peace and not feel the angst. And I think that right now is a challenge for so many Americans, because we're facing things that we've only read about in history books, and it's passing us by. And with every day that passes, we're seeing people's liberties and rights just torn right from their feet.
Yeah, well, I understand that. Now, what I did about that was, and I'm just going to tell you as it was. I mean, I'm not trying to big up anything I did, but there were. I went to university first in 1968, and this remarkable thing happened was that, I was very young. I was 17 when I began, turned 18. I was just a kid. And then something extraordinary happened, which was that the university appointed a black lecturer. Now, universities were white. This is what you have to understand. There was segregation. And the government said, this is an outrage. You may not do this. And the university governing body said, oh, terribly sorry, and withdrew his appointment. And I'd explain why they didn't at in a minute, although we didn't know it at the time. And he was then not given the job. He had a tragic trajectory, went through alcoholism, exile, and God knows, he had a terrible, terrible time of it. But we were so angry as students that we went and occupied the university administration building. We held up for 9 days. The police tried to send other students from Afrikaans universities to beat us up. And eventually we failed. We didn't win. But, it absolutely changed our relationship. I dropped out of university. Other people's parents didn't speak to them ever again as a result of this, because they felt we'd crossed the line. But then
they didn't speak to their own children.
Exactly. And then in 1973, my mother persuaded me to go back to university, and I went back. And then I was much more active, and much more importantly active. And I joined something called the Wages Commission. Now there were about, 8,000 or 9,000 students. There must have been, 50, 60 of us involved in this. And we knew that wages being paid to black workers were unlivable. They were the worst we can possibly imagine. They were starvation wages. They were newspaper articles in Britain calling the wages in South Africa starvation wages. You couldn't live on them. And we basically began organizing trade unions, which had been broken in the 1950s. So 20 years later, they'd been broken. And we through a lot of work and through incredible bravery of the people that we worked with in the townships, the black people who had been organizers in the 50s and 60s, came forward and said, we'll start again. We must do it. And we then organized, we printed pamphlets, leaflets, we distributed them on railway stations. I'll tell you how useless we were. We actually wrote these damn things. They were translated in the townships into isiXhosa, which we didn't speak. And we typed these things up. I know that we even transposed paragraphs. I mean, that's how bad we were. They were really poor. But we gave them out to people at railway stations, and they whipped them under their coats and were gone. And apparently they were read by 10, 15, 20 people, each one of these. And out of those, and out of the extraordinary bravery of the black organizers that we worked with, some of whom were killed, some of them did die. And there were one or two of our people, not in Cape Town, but in Johannesburg, who also were killed. So there was a price to be paid. People were banned, jailed, and so forth. I was lucky I wasn't. And out of that, the black trade union movement was reborn and played a central role in breaking apartheid in the end. But I mean, that was a long time later. So we're talking about the 70s and 80s, and it was only came to fruition in the early 90s. But that came out of my mother's telling me that I should not accept injustice. And I did that. And then I, came over to Britain thinking I'd continue with unionization, but I fell in love, stayed, and went into the journalism.
And when you moved over to England, like, how do you understand? Because I think that's really powerful, and I hope that the listener, the audience, holds on to this. But that notion of feeling that things around you are wrong because they're portrayed as so normal. You move to another country. Do you you had to recognize just the change in your own body language, the way in which you even moved had to have been different.
You can't believe it. It was when I walked around London for the first time, it was as if a load had been taken off my back, as if I was carrying a sack of cement and it had just vanished. And I realized I could say anything I liked, that I could go to any meeting I wanted to. I could read any magazine, any journal. Nothing was banned. I mean, just to give you one example of the idiocy of the South African censorship system, and there were many aspects of it they got rid of most of the stuff. But one of the things that was banned was a book called Black Beauty. Do you know it?
Absolutely.
And you know what it's about?
About the horse.
Yes, but they banned it on the name.
Because of the name. I remember the movie. It was like early 80s, correct? I believe that movie was.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because of the name.
They were laughed out of town, and I must admit, after I think a week, it was unbanned. But it gives you an idea of how much was banned. So it was, you just couldn't read most of the literature. A lot of stuff was circulated as samizdat, underground. And passed between people, and that was just normal. It was what
that was just
did to get a different perspective. And when I came to London, of course, it was very different. Except that there was one big problem. Just before I graduated, because I did an industrial relations degree, a white security officer had been sort of revealed to have penetrated one of the international student union bodies, the International University Exchange Fund. And Craig Williamson was his name, and he was a member of the security police of South Africa. They'd infiltrated it. And there wasn't a trade union that would even give me the time of day. I could get no job. And I wandered around this city rather desolately for about 3 months. I couldn't go back home because I'd fallen in love. We got married, and
life had begun in earnest.
Yeah, and I then just I flipped through the yellow pages. I don't know if you ever had them in America.
We did.
Yeah,
we did. Yes.
I eventually got a job with Mobil Oil for a year as an industrial relations advisor. I wasn't very good at that either. And then I got a job with the Labour Party on Africa, which I knew nothing about, but they thought I did. I blagged my way in, and it was mostly about South Africa, and I represented the Labour Party on the anti-apartheid movement, and that is how I really got involved. Um, I mean, it's a very complicated story, but and then eventually, after 5 years, I did know something about Africa. Was I'd done a lot of research for MPs and for the party, and then I got a job with the BBC on that.
So here's what's fascinating to me, Martin. I think, I don't know what the percent, who knows where you sort of lie. Are you a top 1%? Who knows? But I do think that there are plenty of people that might have had, let's say, a similar background, right? And they move to a nation that is much more free, just from the extent. Of course, every country has its ills, but not maybe as overtly as South Africa did at the time that you were growing up. But no one would have faulted you, I think, in some judge, jury, and executioner sort of environment or setting, if you had said, I just want to enjoy not having this cement on my back anymore. And you could have just gone and done something else, and it would have been this nice story about a gentleman whose father fled Nazi Germany, who had a mother who taught him so much about advocating and standing up for yourself, and decided to, I don't know, open a shop, do a million other things. But at some point in time, it feels like you took hold of your origins, and you come from a refugee, and then you chronicle the lives and experiences of refugees. I just think that that's it sounds a little bit cinematic in that way. Was there a moment that you felt that you could have just gone the other way and said, I don't want anything to do with, it's not that you disrespected other people, but you chose a career that could be, I guess, labeled as one of impact, and chronicling the impact, of people in systems, or systems on people?
Well, I suppose so. I mean, I never thought about it. I just fumbled forward and did what I thought was interesting and the right thing to do at the time. And I was very fortunate. I worked for the BBC World Service, which is is an amazing organization. I mean, sadly short of cash now, but all the money came from the Foreign Office, the British Foreign Office, from the government. And in 30 years of working for them, I never had one phone call, not one phone call or letter telling me what I should say. I mean, I made mistakes, of course, as anybody does, but they were my own and my editors. And yes, of course, we had a row about every story. I mean, what journalist doesn't? But never pressure from the outside. And that was, for me, just absolutely, it was bliss to work for the World Service. Don't let me tell you that I didn't moan about it every day, of course. But what journalist doesn't?
I'm curious, not about the particulars, but more on the impact of you and your concept of safety and the power of words. And if you don't mind sharing the story that eventually led to what happened at the cafe in London, I think is powerful, in the way in which I think groups try to intimidate people, especially journalists. I mean, we just had recently, right, four New York Times reporters subpoenaed by the Trump administration and the DOJ for just reporting what was fact and public domain, information in the public domain. So talk a little bit about, if you don't mind, the cafe in London and what happened to you, but not really on the particulars, other than just what it's like to, I mean, I would think that had to have been a part of you thought, I cannot believe that I'm sitting here going through, like, when you look back at your life and all the different things that you saw, that had to hit you literally and figuratively differently than maybe the average bear, because of your origin story.
Well, I suppose so, but it was. I have to go back to when I was working for the Labour Party, because a young man came into my office, and we met many people from Africa, that was my job. And he said, you must come to my country. And I said, but isn't there a war on? And he said, yeah, you go to Sudan and we will take you into Eritrea. And they were fighting a 30-year war of liberation, which they finally won in 1991. And I went in, my wife came with me. We had an amazing trip. I mean, unforgettable, absolutely unforgettable. And I've been engaged with the Horn of Africa ever since. And I've often met Eritreans, but I always suggest that we should meet in a public space, and because I don't know what's going to happen. So I said, why don't we meet at the British Library? It's a very public area. Lots of, well, there's not big security, but there are people at the entrance who check you down. And then the person just said to me, well, would you mind just meeting just in the courtyard outside? So I said, sure. And I went outside, got him a coffee. And when I sat down, he reached behind his chair, and he had a plastic box full of liquid, and I didn't know what was in it. And he threw it all over me, which was.
Now you can laugh now, but I would imagine, I mean, that very scary and traumatizing event, or I don't want to be hyperbolic about it, but
Well, it was. I mean, it could have been acid. It
yeah.
turned out to be the equivalent of pancake mixture. It was just. Honestly, it was. I'm not. But I'm not trying to tell you that I wasn't shaken up. I was. I was shocked. And I walked backwards towards the entrance where there are some guards, and I said to them, "Just call the police." And this guy went on filming me. He didn't, and yelling in my face that I had criticized his country, and I'd been a disgrace, and Lord knows what else, and that I was lower than dirt, and a few other things. And he had two other people who was filming me at the same time. It was all well organized. And he didn't even stop when the policeman came. And
so what was the impact? What would you say? I just thinking about that, and it wasn't me. I mean, I think that would be and I've been in some dangerous places. I didn't have that happen to me, but you do think there are, sometimes stories go down different paths that you don't foresee. How did that impact the storytelling or the way in which you captured stories? What was the result of that? Any?
No, not really. I mean, the things that really worried me was going around Kampala just after Yoweri Museveni took the town, and the place was full of 13-year-olds with AK-47s and smoking plenty of dope, and it was no light whatsoever. That was worrying. Or being in a coup in Liberia, which when everybody was armed, and you had to go up to the presidential palace, and nobody knew who was going to fire at whom and why. I didn't understand what was going on. I was just trying to tell the story. Or being in Eritrea when we came under attack from Russian, Ethiopian MiGs that were bombing us. Now that was a bit more worrying. I mean, to get pancake mix thrown over you doesn't really compare. So, I mean, when I discovered what it was, I mean, obviously
Yeah.
if it had burnt my skin off, I would have been telling you a different story or not telling you a story at all. But I mean, you can't take that too seriously.
You talk about Kampala. I've been there. I can't imagine it. Obviously, when I went just a few years ago, it was not obviously the environment that you were sent into. But if that's just as sort of an example, take people into how your senses change in environments of war and bloodshed, because it's. I would think that your sense of hearing, everything, your relationship to time has to change. It either slows down, or you are thinking 2-3 steps ahead out of your own desire for survival. How does the human body, how does the human mind adapt to that kind of an environment?
Well, it is. Listen, I don't want to, over dramatize it, but it is intoxicating because, as you say, you are so alive. In a way that you're not in normal circumstances. I mean, most of the lifetime one's fairly relaxed, and one lives a good life or a bad life. You can be more or less depressed or happy. But I mean, you live at one level. When you go into those environments, you live at another level. And yes, you are frightened, and but your main responsibility is to get the story out and to tell it in the best way possible. And one of the big problems is that every single time that you get when I was sent from London to Africa and I arrived in a particular location, the story was always different from the one that you thought it was going to. You told it as one thing and it turned out to be something else, and they just got used to it after a while. And then you're working flat out. I mean, you start at 4 a.m, getting ready to do your morning shows and presentations, and then you get your instructions for material they want for lunchtime, and then you put that out, and then you go to the next location and you get the material for the evening, and you go on until 10 o'clock, and then you're cutting the material for the next morning, and you can be up until midnight. And so you get about 4 or 5 hours sleep if you're lucky, maybe 3 hours. And you do that for a week, you're completely wrecked, and your sense of balance and it goes as well. I don't mean physical balance, but you've got to be really careful about what you say. And you thank goodness we always have a producer, and he tells you what you can and can't say, and hold you up on what you're doing. But I mean, your responsibility is to the audience always, and to try and tell the story to the best of your ability. And particularly when other people are risking their lives to tell you the story that they are telling you, and some of them may be beaten up for, tortured for what they're telling you. So you can imagine the feeling of responsibility and the need to tell that story in the best way that you can get it across. That to me was always the biggest honor and the greatest responsibility. I mean, like nothing else. And do you get it right? I mean, invariably you make mistakes, or you exaggerate this so you don't get this angle. And then you get back to London, and you walk down the corridor and somebody says, "Oh, have you been away?"
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've been on holiday. Yeah. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate when you talked about that, because it sounds like it's counterintuitive to say that it's intoxicating to be in an environment of danger. I personally can relate to that. I had that moment in an African country, this experience where I got tapped on the shoulder and it said that I had been identified, and it was 4:29 in the afternoon. It was basically, you need to be gone by 5. You cannot be seen, kind of a thing. And and then one time getting pulled over where all of a sudden someone had a camera out and soldiers came with machine guns and stopped the vehicle, because they think you're going to take images of a bridge, anything that's sort of federally built or monitored, right? And it does. You're exactly right. It's not about the fear. It's about this exhilaration that is intoxicating. And I don't know. I mean, your experience far outweighs mine, and I know what it feels like when I'm not in those. Like, I almost yearn for those environments, which sounds so, I think, I don't know, odd to people who haven't experienced it. And so I want to close with this, and I hope this is the first of several conversations, because you just have, there's so much to get into, what's going on in South Africa, and so many global stories. But because we've been talking about your background and your family and these sorts of things, I'm curious, because you spent an entire career standing really at the edge of and witnessing other people's fights. And you talked about the power of story and just what that has meant for you to be able to provide even an opening, like to crack the door open so someone's story could get out, that they could be represented and they could be heard. And I'm wondering if you ever reflected back in your time now and wondered how much of your story was being told basically silently, not for the public, through these experiences, like as a way to understand everything that might have been confusing when you were a child. It's just, I just think it's incredibly powerful what you chose to do, and the effort and the commitment you and your family have given towards representing people who often are marginalized.
Well, two things on that. First of all, no, I never think about that. I mean, people have sometimes suggested to me I should write a biography. I have no interest in writing about myself. There's so many other stories to be writing about, which are so much more important. I mean, one that I'm trying to find a way of getting out now is that everyone thinks that slavery is finished. There are still 5 countries in Africa where you can buy, sell, and inherit people. Chattel slavery is alive and well in Africa. And for me, that is such a burning injustice. And, it is so ignored. And the whole story now in Britain is about reparations for the transatlantic slave trade. And people can make up their own mind about whether that's right or wrong. I'm not going to comment on that. But, for me, that is it's so little interest in comparison with the need to stop slavery now. Really stop slavery in Africa now, and that is by far and away the biggest thing that we should be doing in Africa. I mean, there are many other issues which need to be dealt with. I mean, the situation in Sudan is absolutely catastrophic. What is happening in South Africa, my own country originally, is awful. The fact that the 53,000, maybe more, Africans have fled the country because they're under such threat from xenophobia. All those stories, they all need to be told. But, nothing for me beats the the need to free those people who are still enslaved in Africa now.
Well, that says a lot about you, and that is, I know that's the reporter in you, and that is the black sash origins within you. But I will say, as we wrap up, is that as a parent and as someone who advocates and who has been very lucky to travel the world and capture stories of people that you never read about, but I find very profound, is that I would advocate for your story selfishly because I think our younger generations are going to be looking for those that were that and these are my words, you don't have to say them, had the courage to fumble around in a manner that allowed them to find the path that best suited their nature, their ability to, express and exercise a mental, a physical muscle of compassion, care, and impact. And I think that that's in very short supply these days. And so while I absolutely agree that these stories, the fact that 5 countries in Africa are still engaged in the slave trade, if that's not your T1 headline, I don't know what is. But I do find incredible value in the stories of the Martin Plouts of the world, because without your stories, we're lost in a world that feels sort of like it's slipping away in a lot of directions. So I do mean that. I hope this is the first of many conversations, because you're right, there's so many topics to be discussing. But this is a fantastic way for the audience to get to know you a little bit. We want to thank Martin Plout. I know I'm impacted. I just want to remind people you can read him at Fair Observer. He's got he's working on his book on slavery, African slavery. He's got the hamster on Hampstead Heath, which we talked about at the onset of this at this interview. But we want to thank our friends at Fair Observer. Independence, Diversity, Debate, where you can understand the world one perspective at a time. You can check out my book, The Narrative Edge, Authentic Storytelling That Meets the Moment by Wiley, at wherever books are sold. We want to thank Martin. And once again, I'm your host, Dr. Rod Berger. This has been another episode of the Dr. Rod Berger Show, presented by my friends at Fair Observer. If you're looking for independence, diversity, and debate, you can go to fairobserver.com, where we understand the world one perspective at a time.